Okay, I might be a bit late, but Cyberpunk Edgerunners is one of the most unlikely anime to come out of recent times. If you had told me in 2020, following the initial disappointment towards the game's release, that fast forward 2 years, we would have an anime and a fantastic one no less, I wouldn't have believed you. But here we are today, with arguably one of the best and unarguably one of the most unique anime of 2022. So with that being said, let's get straight into it, Cyberpunk Edgerunners and what makes it so good. Obviously, in my personal opinion. And as a quick disclaimer before we begin, as per usual, this is a predominantly non-spoiler review. I won't talk directly about key plot points past episode 1, but if you want to go in completely blind, then of course, be my guest. So, let's get into it. Cyberpunk Edgerunners follows 17-year-old David Martinez, a delinquent student living in the dystopian metropolis that is Night City, sometime in the mid to late 21st century, before the events of the game in, well, 2077. And speaking of the game, it's at this point I should admit, I know nothing about it, not one thing, I've never played it, but with the beauty of the anime, it doesn't matter, it conveys the world of Cyberpunk incredibly well, and in that regard, it's accessible for both anime fans and Cyberpunk fans alike without compromising either side. But anyway, back to the synopsis. David attends the prestigious Arasaka Academy, where he's a model student in terms of academics, but is heavily stigmatized due to his lack of wealth, living in a rundown apartment with his mother. And long story short, his mother, Gloria Martinez, earns her living as a medical technician who sells cyberware, essentially body modifications that enhance a person's ability, until she's abruptly killed in a car accident, resulting in David choosing for himself to implant the cyberware his mother was holding onto at the time of her death, a military-grade equipment called a Sandevistan, which is also an item in the game, allowing its user to essentially slow down time and travel at lightning speed. And this is where the artistic prowess of this anime truly comes alive. There's one thing so far I'm yet to talk about that helps further distinguish this anime, and that is the art and aesthetic, which comes as no surprise given the studio in question, none other than Studio Trigger, one of the most artistically talented and unique studios in all of anime. Kill la Kill and Promare are two great examples of the spectacles of animation Trigger consistently delivers, and while here it's less of a visual spectacle in terms of unbelievable animation during action scenes like you'd get in, say, Demon Slayer for example, instead it's much more subtle, focusing on immense detail in the characters and their surroundings, and much like the aforementioned Kill la Kill and Promare, it is colourful as all hell, making the world feel that much more alive. Trigger's trademark, vibrant, almost cartoonish aesthetic is present from start to finish, and I love it. I think it looks fantastic. From the little I know about the franchise, with how interesting the world appears to be, the anime only enhances it that much more. The art in Cyberpunk Edgerunners is not the kind of art and animation that leaves you jaw-dropped or hyped like in a shonen. Instead, it heightens emotions on the other end of the spectrum. At times, it is beautifully somber and bleak. And all this does is distinguish the anime that much more, with much of what I've been saying also being applicable to the soundtrack. Again, being much more orientated towards preying on your emotions instead of hyping you up as you might otherwise expect for such an action-packed show. I'm no musician, but thanks in no small part to Netflix, the soundtrack is phenomenal, and it's always a nice change of pace seeing Western musicians provide anime soundtracks, including Franz Ferdinand as the opening, and again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it distinguishes the anime that much more. But anyway, back to the plot itself. Following the death of his mother, David decides to abandon academia and, like so many others in his world, pursues a life of crime as an edgerunner, joining a gang who eventually become our main cast, and what a likeable bunch they are. Alongside David, we have our deuteragonist Lucy, a netrunner or hacker essentially, Main, the boss of the group, and our side characters, Dorio, Pilar, Kiwi, and of course, Rebecca, who's been pretty much inescapable this past week or two. And along with everyone else, for good reason. Our central characters are all likeable from the get-go, and the dynamic and dialogue between each of them is incredibly entertaining. It's fluid and witty, allowing you to get emotionally invested in them surprisingly quickly. I feel that in a lot of anime where there's a clearly defined squad of main characters, the ones that get less screen time sort of just fade away into the background, existing just for the sake of having more characters, or for a specific purpose like being killed off. A comic kill. Whereas here, despite being a relatively small cast, it's a case of quality over quantity. Although, in its entirety, the majority of interactions are between Lucy and David, the others don't feel forgotten. Much like the art itself, the cast are full of life and character. They are all individuals making the best out of a bad life, people trapped at the bottom of society, each with their own goals and ambitions, fighting against the system of oppression pinning them down, a brutal cycle underpinning the corruption of Night City. The plot is gritty, dark, and most obviously of all, violent and unforgiving. The action scenes are both visually impressive, with David's afterimage from the Sandevistan being a great example, and often have immense emotional weight packed behind them. The cruel and unforgiving dystopia they live in is no more evident than in the violence itself. After all, a lot of the time, they're fighting other criminals and gangs in the same position they're in, living in a world virtually dependent on drugs, crime and violence. It is a constant struggle, both against themselves and the world around them, making the most out of their lack of freedom, essentially as mercenaries for hire, at the request of the privileged in society, who puppeteer the city from behind the scenes. And even with these common shared values, they all feel distinct and likeable on an individual basis, although the main cast do follow slight character tropes, like Lucy being the quiet, mysterious one, and David being a typical naive teenager type figure. There's no traditionally annoying anime tropes. The fact that this anime feels quite un-anime in places, in the sense that it doesn't adhere to typical anime tropes and cliches, like say needless fanservice, annoying character types like tsunderes for example, and the dreaded power of friendship, is one of its best strengths, avoiding all of these eye-rolling ideas that I personally don't like. But what I do like, that I want to briefly dive into, is the voice acting, specifically in the English dub. Now, if there's one thing I hate about the anime community, it's the elitist attitude towards subs, and how Japanese is always better when in reality it's no longer 2004. Modern dubs, especially under Netflix, are fantastic. And this is epitomised in Cyberpunk. First of all, the voice actors are simply well picked and suit the characters nicely in my opinion, like David being played by Zach Aguilar, who played Tanjiro in Demon Slayer and Genos in One Punch Man, a pretty good fit if you ask me. And with the budget of Netflix, they can afford to bring in some bigger names, most significantly one of the main antagonists, Faraday, played by Giancarlo Esposito, obviously best known for Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. And secondly, the western setting of Night City works in its favour. The same reason something like Bacano works so well in English, the 1920s gangster environment doesn't work well unless they all sound like Al Capone, and that they do, making it more authentic. And here, especially considering the source material is western in the first place, the script feels suited well to English, especially with some of the smaller details, like the street slang they use, and how swearing doesn't sound forced, just for the sake of being edgy, which you often see in other anime dubs. But anyway, back on topic, and a key point of criticism I've seen brought up recently is its length at only 10 episodes. More specifically, its incredibly fast pacing. It's short but sweet, a whole lot of action, condensed into not a lot of runtime. Near the beginning especially, things happen at lightning speed in order to quickly establish the synopsis and get on with it. Finish the starter to get to the main course, where although admittedly another episode or two would have been nice to build up our main cast that much more, does that imply the anime was rushed, as I've seen some people say? No, not at all. I think the key element that makes the plot work so well is momentum. With how short it is, it constantly keeps the ball rolling without a single lapse in speed. Whereas, say, on the opposite end of the spectrum, a show like Monster is an incredibly slow burn that works to its advantage through slow methodical build-up, Cyberpunk is incredibly fast and uses it to its full advantage by ensuring it never misses a beat. It's densely packed and therefore keeps its momentum going. For instance, the relationship between David and Lucy is at the centre of the entire story, and despite being short, it still manages to feel developed and layered without being forced or at all superficial. It does the bare minimum, but in a good way. There's no single wasted scene that could otherwise be cut. But anyway now, moving on completely to yet another thing I love, is how brilliantly the anime captures the setting itself of Night City. Simply put, it feels alive, both in aesthetic and the minute details that sell the dystopian atmosphere it's after. I know this is picking low-hanging fruit, but one of the problems I have with isekai anime, even the good ones, are just how boring and soulless the settings themselves are. For instance, if you were to take the cast of, say, Re:Zero and put them in another isekai setting, not much changes. But applying this analogy to Cyberpunk, this wouldn't work. The plot and the setting is so deeply embedded, it feels much more unique. Society shapes the city, and the city shapes society. An endless cycle that creates the rough and grimy atmosphere this anime captures so perfectly. As Lucy puts it, it's a cage of light, trapping our protagonists in the spotlight cast down upon them. Even in the way it's framed, you never get a bird's eye view of the city, it's always a shot looking upwards, capturing the city from the ground, gazing up against vast skyscrapers confining civilians within their shadows. Essentially, it creates a fantastic sense of scale. The city is massive, and the anime does it justice, creating one of the most visually interesting and unique settings in all of anime. But with that being said, I think I should draw to a quick conclusion. Cyberpunk Edgerunners is fantastic, no doubt. In fact, you probably already know that, considering how late this video is, my apologies, but it doesn't make it any less true. Cyberpunk Edgerunners is an anomaly in the sense that anime adaptations of source materials that aren't a manga, light novel or visual novel often end up falling flat, that's no secret. And from now on, as CD Projekt Red have done with Cyberpunk, I'd imagine some of the big developers like EA and Activision will probably follow suit in years to come. For better or for worse, time will tell. But regardless, Cyberpunk has set a new standard when it comes to adaptation. When a piece of media works well, both part of the franchise it belongs to, and as a standalone piece of entertainment enjoyed by anyone else, I think it's a clear sign of success. And with that, what more needs to be said? A fantastic anime that I don't think anyone expected, yet still managed to deliver in pretty much all the ways it could. So with that being said, I'll be back in the next video. See ya!